Story. Let's welcome Darlene.
All right, so I'm the youngest of 6 children. My closest sibling is 11 years older than I am. My mother is also the youngest of 6. The closest sibling to her is a good decade older as well. And my grandfather, Papa Pepe, was the youngest of 14, born in 1906. I have a vague memory of my grandparents. All I remember is sitting on the couch in the living room, looking back at the kitchen, and seeing a grumpy-looking, mustachioed old man glaring straight at me. My mother only shared little snippets of family tales that would fascinate me, but when I would ask questions, she would never know the answer. Her parents rarely spoke about their life before my mother was born in 1949. Her family often ignored her as the youngest child, which was the same for me growing up, and I can only imagine what it was like for my grandfather being the youngest of 14. So, I come from a long lineage of children who were left out of the loop. Papa Pepe passed away when I was a toddler from Parkinson's in '85, and my grandmother passed away from cancer a year earlier in '84. There are times when I wonder what it'd be like to have them here now, but then I say to myself, Darlene, they'd be 110 years old right now. Let's get back to reality. I've done little research because I haven't had the time, but it has been a lifelong dream of mine to search the history of my family. My brother, who's 11 years older than me, knew a few more tales, but when I asked questions, he'd give me his theories. I have no idea if they're true or not. My mom and I are beginning the journey, albeit very slowly, to find answers. So I'm going to tell you the story of what I know of my family from the help of my mother, my brother, Ancestry.com, and the Department of Homeland Security. All right, here we go. My grandmother, Mama Lola, was from a wealthy Mexican family. To be painfully honest, to be a wealthy Mexican family in the late 19th and early 20th century, chances are you were white and actually Spanish. My brother theorized we're most likely descendants of conquistadors. My mother would describe my grandma as a tall, fair-skinned woman with red hair and green eyes. She would wear her finest dress, complete with white gloves, hat, and dress shoes, even if she was going to the grocery store. My mom, on the other hand, looks absolutely nothing like the woman she described. In the 60s and 70s, the Chicano civil rights movement with Cesar Chavez was going strong, and my mom's mission was to help as many migrant field workers in California as she could, with getting them proper health care, food, and shelter. So there was my short mom out in the fields with her thick black hair tied back with a bandana and her worn out jeans and t-shirt. And the workers, they would treat my mother like an equal. That was until they met Mama Lola. My mom was horrified when she showed up in the fields dressed up in her absolute best, gloves and all, and carrying little sack lunches. The workers would remove their hats and from that point on would only speak informal Spanish to my mom. And she pleaded with them to stop and to continue on as if they hadn't met her. And when my Mama Lola met my grandfather, they were both 18 years old. And as my brother put it, all hell broke loose. And that was because my grandfather was a native, and now it was becoming clear where my mom got her looks. My brother theorized again, yeah, that's probably why they immigrated to the US. Her family was definitely going to murder him. They immigrated to the US in 1928, over 20 years before my mom was born. And during our research, we recently learned that my grandparents first settled in San Francisco and owned a pool bar. This blew our minds completely. Our very proper, old-fashioned family owning a seedy bar in the underbelly of the city. It's impossible to me to envision my fancy-dressed, perfectly coiffed Mama Lola as a barmaid serving beer and kicking out the riffraff. They eventually ended up in LA, and Papa Pepe was a barber, and my Mama Lola a good old-fashioned housewife. And in 1947, my grandparents had 5 beautiful, healthy children. The youngest was a 9-year-old boy, and he died tragically when he was hit by a bus in Guadalajara, Mexico, a city they were visiting at a time. And as the legend goes, my Mama Lola was in the kitchen cooking when suddenly she dropped everything and ran out of the house and into the city and found her dying son and cradled him in her arms as he passed. My mother would arrive a little over a year later, which explained the gap between the ages of the 4 surviving children and my mom. Well, the legend behind the gap in age with myself and my siblings is not as mythical. My mom actually didn't like giving birth. She had my brother and vowed to never do it again. She inherited 4 children when she married my father, and it would be another 6 years before I arrived by surprise. She told me that she thought she was dying of cancer. So she went to the doctor and said, "Give it to me straight, doc." To which he replied, "You're not dying, Mrs. Valencia. You're just pregnant." The biggest mystery of our family was our name. In Mexico, the way you formally introduce yourself is to say your first name, your last name, and then your mother's maiden name. So my name in Mexico is Darlene Valencia de Anda. De Anda being my grandfather's name. However, when I would introduce myself, people from Mexico would gasp and blush. And it's not a common name like Martinez or Lopez, but when I would ask my mom why they would look so surprised, she would shrug and be like, "I don't know." I grew up in a small town in Oregon, and in the mid-90s, it opened its first Mexican store with candy, canned goods, and movies. And inside there were movie posters plastered all over the walls, but one caught my eye in particular. On it was a mustachioed man, reminiscent of my grandfather. Although this guy had a grimace on his face, was holding a gun with a big explosion in the background. And his name was Gilberto de Anda. And when I asked my mom if we were related to him, she shrugged and said, "Maybe." Thankfully, a few years later, Google came out and I learned that Gilberto came from a huge family of producers, directors, and actors. His brother Rodolfo played Zorro in Mexico and even made it to Hollywood, acting alongside Tom Berenger. But who knows? My grandparents never said anything about this to my mother growing up. And my grandfather was full of old sayings that he just used to make up. And when they would sit down in front of a good meal, he would say, "Mucho bueno, very fine. Toma tequila, Van Dyne. Drink tequila, Van Dyne." My mom had no idea what that meant, but she just went with it. So when I was growing up, and we would sit down in front of a good meal, she'd be like, as Papa Pepe would say, "Mucho bueno, very fine. Toma tequila, Van Dyne." The sassy teenager that I was replied, "That doesn't even make sense. Who is Van Dyne?" "Maybe it's a type of tequila back then," she'd say. And I'd fire back, "Tequila is Mexican. Van Dyne, what is that? Dutch?" And my mom was like, "I don't know. It was what Papa Pepe would say." And after the recent revelation of my bar-owning grandparents, I wonder if this was an inside joke told at the bar. Perhaps Van Dyne was a regular and it meant be good, be fine, and drink Van Dyne's tequila. But who knows? And I'm dying to find out. I can track down if I'm related to the Mexican filmmaking family, but I may never know who Van Dyne is. And as a writer, I can't help but rewrite this saying. And instead, I'll say to my future children when we sit down in front of a good meal, "Mucho bueno, very fine, toma tequila, and wine." It makes much more sense, and it sounds like a life motto, albeit a bit enabling to drink various types of alcohol at once. But it's so good, it should be on our family crest. And I feel now like my Papa Pepe can rest in peace. For now, I have a saying of my own, and with it, I can create a new story and a new family legend.